enslaved and free people of color who lived and worked in London town and on the South River. As part of that effort, I'm pleased to announce that historic London Town and Gardens is now recognized as an official site of memory in the UNESCO Slave Route Project Resistance, Liberty, and Heritage. We join 30 other sites throughout the United States proven to be ports of entry for enslaved Africans. As part of our commemoration of this, we will soon be premiering a new exhibit panel in the front room, the same place we checked into the lecture series, explaining our connection to the slave trade and a brief history of that. The Big Read with the Conversation Starters is another project that we're happy to be joining in. The Big Read is an effort by many sites, especially libraries here in Anne Arundel County, to get everyone reading the same book. You may have noticed in the front room where you signed in, we have copies of The Big Smoke. It's a poetry collection about the African-American boxer Jack Johnson. Those books are free. Help yourself to one of those books. Next weekend, on the 9th at 2 p.m., the Conversation Starters, who we've often partnered with in the past, will be leading a book discussion about The Big Smoke. So grab a copy of that, give it a read, and come on back next Saturday at 2 p.m. That event is free. It does follow our morning lecture. And that morning lecture is by Dr. Namada Whiten, who will be speaking about the diaspora from Sierra Leone to the United States, or what would become the United States. This is especially relevant for us. One of the slave ships we know sailed here in London Town did come directly from Sierra Leone. So we're trying to build that African context back into our history. The next weekend, the 16th, Saturday the 16th, we're hosting Brenda Parker. She's the lead African-American historical interpreter for Mount Vernon. She'll be talking about how we apply history. How do we teach that difficult history to mixed and varied audiences? Our last speaker on June the 23rd, Saturday the 23rd, is Janice Hayes Williams. She's currently employed in the county executive's office here in Anne Arundel County. She'll be speaking about the impact and importance of African American history. Also coming up March 30th and 31st is Maryland Day weekend. Admission is only $1. And on June 22nd, we're happy to have Uncertain Freedom 1864 returning here to historic London town. That we're joined by a big group of African American historical interpreters to interpret the collapse of slavery in Maryland in 1864, as well as exploring the almshouse that once resided here. Don't forget to become a member today. I heard some of you talking about memberships out there. Memberships are a great way to get bang for your buck. Free admission for a full year, 10% off in the gift shop, discounted admission for special programs. That's also really helpful to us. It helps support our mission. So if you're not a member, consider becoming one today. If you are a member, we'll be happy to re-up your membership at the front desk. Be sure to swing by there on your way out. Now, enough of me going on and on. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sharita Jacobs Thompson. She's a former assistant professor of Civil War era studies and Africana studies at Gettysburg College. Currently, she's an independent scholar and a consultant in Washington, D.C. Her research focuses on the African American experience during the American Civil War and the Reconstruction era. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sharita Jacobs Thompson as she presents Competing Realities of Black Southern Marylanders and Their Quest to Shape Freedom in Loyal, Maryland, 1860 to 1880.
Thank you, Kyle. And again, thank you all for coming out. I know today was a little nasty, so I certainly appreciate you coming out. So first, again, my name is Sharita Jacobs Thompson. My research revolves around slavery and the transition to freedom in Southern Maryland during the Civil War Reconstruction era, and I go a little bit beyond Reconstruction as well. So this is a work in progress. It's a part of a larger study that is moving from the dissertation phase to the book phase. We'll see how that goes. It's a work in progress, but here it goes. So the work actually looks at Southern Maryland specifically, and you'll hear as I go through this why I focused on that area. And so we're talking about Howard County, Charles County, Prince George's County, St. Mary's County. I do touch on Anne Arundel County, but after I got into the research, I found that Anne Arundel County was starting to look a little bit like Baltimore in terms of its mixed economy as we move closer and closer to the Civil War. So a little bit less on that and a little bit counties that still will be holding to tobacco crop as a staple crop, as well as an to produce. So, in introduction is Black Southern Marylanders who sought support from the federal government during the Civil War and in the post-emancipation period. This work suggests that Maryland's professed loyalty to the Union, the internal dismantling of its peculiar institution by state action opposed to a federal directive, and the Democrats' unhindered power to guide what would be deemed self-reconstruction significantly shaped Black Southern Marylanders' Civil War, emancipation, and post-war experiences. Black Southern Marylanders were not alone in confronting the arduous task of surviving war and freedom. What is more, evidence suggests that Black people in the former Confederacy lacked sufficient federal support to smooth their transition from slavery to freedom. However, this study argues that Black Southern Marylanders residing in a state that had all of its rights reserved encountered formidable obstacles that were often absent in the experiences of their counterparts in the Confederacy. During this defining period, free people confronted social, economic, and political injustice. As Black Southern Marylanders strove for a more tolerable post-war condition, they were often hindered by the lack of federal intervention on their behalf. This compelled one Black Marylander to conclude that free people would have progressed if the state had, quote, withdrawn from the Union and shared the Confederacy's fate. As the radical Republicans were dividing the Confederate states into military districts and compelling them to hold state constitutional conventions, which included eligible Black men, white Marylanders were already directing Reconstruction unfettered by congressional mandates. Furthermore, when the move towards reconciliation permeated the country, the federal government was even more willing to invoke a laissez-faire policy toward the state. This approach certainly proved detrimental to the well-being of the region's Black population. This work recasts slavery, emancipation, and Reconstruction Maryland by examining its transition from slavery to freedom from a regional perspective. General histories of Civil War and Reconstruction era Maryland often grant passing consideration to the southern region and tend instead to focus on Baltimore and the northern areas, where a diversified economy significantly diminished dependence on slave labor before the Civil War. The southern region, however, resembled the plantation South in that it remained economically dependent on a single staple crop. It was also home to a large enslaved population and a powerful planter class. By 1860, the southern counties looked vastly different from the eastern, western, and northern areas. The region maintained more than 48,000 slaves, exceeding the collective sum for the rest of the state. Unlike in these regions, the enslaved continued to outnumber the growing free Black population by more than 3 to 1. The southern counties were economically homogeneous, with the great majority of the enslaved population working in a static environment dominated by tobacco cultivation. The economic system offered few alternatives to agricultural pursuits, lacking not only crop diversification, but industry as well. For these reasons, it is important to extract Southern Maryland and investigate its transitional period, focusing on the complexity of a region that once linked its future with the Confederacy, but benefited from the myth of Union loyalty. This study employs resources such as the pension records, I spent quite a bit of time in those, to examine Black Southern Marylanders' wartime and post-war experiences. As in the Confederate States, the Civil War interrupted Maryland's social, economic, and political systems. Black Southern Marylanders, however, inhabited the border state, and this regional Blacks. This study examines the topics thus far neglected. For instance, previous scholarship ignored the District of Columbia's role in Black Southern Marylanders' antebellum wartime and post-war experiences. In doing so, they disregard the inextricable link between regional Blacks and the capital city. In addition, earlier studies on Maryland have either diminished or relegated Black women's experience to general narratives. This study focuses on the complexity of those experiences and examines how the region's Black women negotiated negotiated wartime and post-war societies. Now, in 1979, I came across a work by George William McDaniel, and in it he lamented, quote, "Too little attention has been given to the peculiar side effect of the lack of Reconstruction in the border states," end quote. Scholars continue to largely ignore the rich and varied experiences of Black people who occupied space in the border states during the Civil War and in its aftermath. However, there are studies that have commenced the process of casting light on the state of Maryland. And that vein, the study continues that tradition, but more specifically focuses on a region where slavery had been entrenched and thus its transition more challenging. So my talk is divided into 4 sections this morning. The first part situates Black Southern Marylanders within the context of the District of Columbia's expanding pre-war, wartime, and post-war Black community. It grapples with questions such as, how did the Civil War alter the District of Columbia's role in the lives of free Black Southern Marylanders? What refugees from the Confederacy provide fleeing Black Southern Marylanders? What was the role of the established Black community in free people's wartime and post-war transitions? The second part focuses on gender issues and considers Black women's wartime and post-war experiences. What role did the federal government play in the lives of the region's enslaved and free Black women? How did the federal government respond to these women that they encountered? In what way did that response differ for Black women who hailed from the Confederate states? How did single and widowed women navigate the obstacles that accompany freedom? What kind of labor did rural and urban Black women perform in the post-war period? In the aftermath of the Civil War, Maryland theoretically avoided military reconstruction, and the Democrats quickly regained control of the state. The third part is guided by questions such as, how did the expeditious return of Democrats impact state and federal reconstruction policies for the Southern area? How did the entrenchment of the Democrats determine the local course of Reconstruction? Under the Democrats' control, to what extent were free people able to exercise political influence? How did their political experience affect their interpretation of the meaning of freedom? Finally, Part 4 examines post-war Southern Maryland. It considers questions like this. How did Black Southern Marylanders overcome the obstacles that threatened their social, political, and economic progress? For those who remained in the region, how were they able to carve out a space for themselves in a free society? What role did Baltimore as well as Washington, D.C. play in their post-war experiences? What type of labor did these migrants perform? How did migrants support family members left behind? So those are some of the questions that I attempt to answer in this work. So, according to President Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War ushered in freedom, end quote. The federal government assisted in defining the meaning of freedom in the form of Confederacy, for they instituted wartime policies and commenced crafting a post-war strategy before Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. However, in Maryland, presidential and congressional Reconstruction policies failed to relieve free people of suffering. The state avoided post-war military rule. Despite frequent letters to Congress to extend military activities to the state, maintained civil laws, and limited the Freedmen's Bureau's authority. Hence, border state Maryland was largely unaffected by the federal government's effort. The ability of Maryland planters, state and local legislators to manipulate the federal apparatus meant that free people's experience were less influenced by policies that shaped freedom in the Deep South. Ultimately, by the time redemption, reconciliation, and abject repression of Black contract was up and he was nowhere to be found. So when we talk about Washington, D.C., the introduction to this part goes a little something like this. So on April 17, 1862, an editorial in the Port Tobacco Times declared that the District of Columbia's Emancipation Act threatened to disturb Maryland's peculiar institution. The editor decried with its passage, quote, Washington becomes at once a free Negro rendezvous and a slave hiding place, end quote. While it is important to note that this act played a significant role in reshaping slavery in Maryland, The editor's pronouncements are a little deceptive. Enslaved and manumitted Black Southern Marylanders have for decades used the District of Columbia to give broader meaning to the concept of freedom. For them, the District of Columbia was more than the seat of the national government. Since its formation, Washington had provided regional Blacks with support. Enslaved people residing in the state's bordering counties used the city to escape the harsh realities of a plantation society. Manumitted Blacks flocked to the nation's capital to escape repressive Maryland laws, which threatened to curtail their freedom. Regionally enslaved Blacks who labored in the city earned income that aided in purchasing their freedom. Furthermore, when absconding, the enslaved capitalized on the intolerant pro offered by the city's expanding free Black community. So I suggest in this section that the Civil War effectively complicated Black Southern Marylanders' ability to employ the district as a center of refuge. I contend that Maryland's ostensible loyalty and the federal government's need to maintain the state and the Union were critical in restricting and reshaping Washington's role in the lives of regional Blacks during the Civil War and Reconstruction. The upheaval caused by the conflict encouraged the region's free and enslaved population to travel the short distance that separated Southern Maryland and the capital city. However, regional Blacks who hastened to Washington encountered city officials and a federal government invested in protecting the property rights of Marylanders. So a lot of stuff that I read spoke about how if you reached the city, Washington, D.C., after 1862 with the Emancipation Act there, you found some protection from the government. But in my own research, I found many things that countered that position. So I found court records where fugitive slaves who were captured were being returned via the court to their slave owners in Southern Maryland. I also found evidence that slave catchers were actually coming into the city and removing those slaves. And it was hard enough because if you were running into the city, they had slave catchers along the road waiting for you, right? So this was not as easy as some people have dismissed this idea that if you made it to the capital city, because at the end of the day, President Lincoln didn't want any problems with Maryland, right? He didn't want these two states. He didn't want the capital city to be surrounded by two states, right, that were part of the Confederacy. So he was trying everything in his power to keep Maryland satisfied, and a part of that was returning those slaves to their owners. So I found plenty of evidence that Maryland owners were going into the District of Columbia to recapture their slaves, and some very interesting stories about what they did once they got them and took them back into the counties. So during the early months of the war, the federal government assuaged the concerns of white Marylanders by swiftly responding to the state's fleeing enslaved population. Concurrently, Congress refrained from proposing meaningful legislation to protect fugitives escaping from the border states. The district more strictly enforced the fugitive slave law. In addition, a marshal of the district was accused of being complicit in apprehending and returning Maryland's runaways. Hence, Black Southern Marylanders' capacity to seek asylum in the nation's capital was significantly diminished. Even once fugitives escaping from the Confederate States commenced entering the city largely unmolested, Black Marylanders contended with the federal response to the regional planners prepared to exploit the notion of state loyalty. So you had actually a whole group of planters from Prince George's County that went into the city to talk to federal officials and try to get them to understand that it was their responsibility to uphold the fugitive slave laws and return the slaves. So there's much primary source documents that speak to that. So after the war, regional Blacks' access to the district was again compromised. The federal government limited aid to dispel the idea that it would support idleness. In addition, agents with the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, the organization charged with transitioning free people from slavery to freedom, discouraged Black Marylanders' post-war aspirations to start anew in the nation's capital. They strongly urged those hailing from Southern Maryland to seek economic opportunities in the counties from whence they came. They also persuaded them to participate in the Freedmen's Bureau Transportation Program. This created a diaspora that separated families and relocated newly freed people to unfamiliar states in the North and the West. Moreover, Washington's established Black community became overburdened and fatigued by the penniless refugees of the Confederacy who descended upon the city. Black Southern Marylanders who sought freedom traditionally depended on the support of Black Washingtonians. However, during Reconstruction, they faced significant challenges as they competed for the community's diminishing resources. So when we talk about Washington, D.C., I have this other slide. So there's several things going on in regards to how Black Southern Marylanders' labor is being used, not just during the war, but even before the war. So again, this photograph speaks to the fact that many of them are going into the city as it's being established to help establish infrastructure. But you also, as the need for those particular enslaved people starts to wane and wither again, after a lot of construction is done, then you find a lot of Black women from Southern Maryland who are actually going into the city. Because now those white Washingtonians who are being established there need domestics. And so now they're going into the city to work. But you also find, I also found that Southern Marylanders who did not need, so a lot of them who inherited slaves that they didn't need, they're actually allowing them to go settle in Washington, D.C. and send them money that's a part of the money that they're earning there. So you also find those labor arrangements. And those are very interesting because the same folks who allow them to go into Washington, D.C. under these agreements, when D.C. emancipation comes, you find them because they're also applying to get money for those slaves who have gone to live in Washington, D.C., right? So they're getting paid for those slaves who are really in a quasi-free status living and working in Washington, D.C. So I found a lot of evidence of that as well. So you find that. And then you also find situations where people like Anthony Bowen. Anthony Bowen was enslaved in Prince George's County. He engages in these sorts of arrangements with his owner, where he goes into Washington, D.C. with the promise that once he works and earns enough money, he will send that back to pay for his freedom. And that's exactly what happened. So Anthony Bowen ends up making up a part of this free growing Black population in Washington, D.C. Now this is actually the YMCA that bears his name now. It was actually the first African-American YMCA. It's off of W Street in Washington, D.C., and it was opened in 1853 because of the efforts of Anthony Bowen. So you have African-Americans like Anthony Bowen who go and really provide something for the Black community, institution building that he engages in. And other Prince George's counties who go and sell in Washington, D.C., they are actually very much engaged in building institutions to support the free Black community. But they're also protecting runaways too, right? So Anthony Bowen is interesting because once he becomes free, he also starts saving up money to purchase the freedom of his family members. So eventually he's able to get all his family members in Washington, D.C. And so you find that a lot. So it is interesting when I have students who say, well, didn't Black people buy other Black people and purchase them and use their labor? I said, well, yeah, but a lot of that is misleading. Why is it misleading? Because a lot of them are purchasing their family members, but it's still a transaction, right? So it's still documented as a transaction. And one thing I always find interesting is that when you're looking at, when you get to D.C. emancipation in April of 1862, you have a commission that Congress puts together to value, because it's compensated emancipation. So you have a commission that's put together by the government, and so they're supposed to place a value on slaves so they can compensate their owners. And so what becomes interesting is there was a Black man that I came across who actually applied to be compensated for a young boy and about his what turned out to be his wife and two of his daughters. And he was actually compensated for them because legally he owned them, right? So he was able to be compensated for his family members who he purchased out of slavery. And so you find that in the record as well. But this growing free community actually provides safety for Southern Marylanders who are running away, who oftentimes are their family members. So if you look at the newspaper advertisements during the antebellum period, you often see things like, I think he's hiding in Georgetown with his mother who's working here. Or she run away to Washington, D.C. To join her family who's encouraged her to flee. So you often find that as well, that the black community is providing some safety for these runaways, even if it's temporary before they can go further north. Okay. So in the second section, I take this title from a quote I found from a man who said, "Colored women had many battles to fight." That was the quote. So this section is about women and their particular experiences, pre-war, wartime, and post-war. So the introduction goes like this. Almost 1 year after President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation of Prince George's County, gathered her 5 children and fled the Woodlawn Plantation where she was a slave for the Thompson family. No relation. Shortly before absconding, she packed her belongings and stored them with a free black family residing nearby. With her worldly possessions safely stowed, she waited for the precise moment to escape Maryland's southern region to seek refuge with friends in Baltimore. Along the way, she entrusted her family's safety to a black man who served as their guide. He, quote, misled and robbed them of $5 and a bundle of clothing, end quote. Moreover, his actions led to Emily's capture, and with her children, she was thrown in jail. Emily was in prison for a short time before her master, Colonel Livingston Thompson, arrived. He appeared, quote, brandishing hands filled with stones and threatened to have her whipped, end quote. And